This is a topic that comes up pretty often whenever there's a new update or a new change or, what have you. And it's something I wanted to look at. This is going to be a pretty abstract topic for the most part. We're just going to go through a couple updates that have happened in recent-ish time and go through what type of player they impact the most, just to try to figure out who Klei balances around. There is a lot to cover in a topic like this, so I'm definitely not going to get everything in it. I do think it's an interesting thing to delve into at the very least, so hopefully this kind of opens a door for, that kind of talk, those kind of ideas. So without further ado, let's establish what we're going to do. Let's start with some character updates by looking at 3 different characters, those being WX, Wolfgang, and Willow, since these will cover character updates and each points as they happen, as well as the varying degrees of how good a character is seen, at least by my opinion. With WX being the midpoint, Wolfgang in the later end, and Willow being near the beginning of the updates, as well as the varying degrees of, let's say, power that these characters have. Then we could go and talk about the content updates, and the ones that I've had are the Return of Them updates, since those have been probably the most impactful in recent memory. So without further ado, let's begin with the characters. Willow's update was one of the first character reworks, and it's a pretty interesting one to look back at. Willow's a pretty interesting character and her changes were pretty big. Pre-rework Willow was a pretty bad character, all things considered. She was often looked at as the worst character in the game. Though she didn't have the downside of randomly setting fires and Don't Starve together, she was basically her base game Don't Starve counterpart. The issue with her was fundamentally that she had a lot of downsides and didn't have any good perks to go along with them. All Willow had was a torch with significantly less light radius, and immunity to fire damage, as well as sanity from that fire. This was pretty underwhelming, and though she does keep some of her upsides, those being regaining sanity and the immunity to fire in her rework, she has a bunch of neat perks that just help her out in the average day-to-day. She can cook food faster, and she has increased fuel efficiency, just to name a couple. But most notably, she has Bernie now, which helps out with drawing aggros from sanity monsters whenever he's in his small form, and when Willow is at low sanity and has Bernie, and Bernie gets big, it can be used to attack any nearby enemy and draw aggro from them. So who is the character aimed towards as far as her perks go? I'd say it's a pretty safe assertion to say that Willow was geared towards new players. Willow is a character you unlock pretty early on in base game Don't Starve, and likewise she's a pretty introductory character in Don't Starve Together. She's primarily meant to get you used to sanity as far as I can tell, since she both gains and loses sanity easier compared to most other characters, and she also has Bernie, which will help defend you from nightmare creatures, at least until you're able to deal with the nightmare creatures yourself. This as a mechanic is pretty few and far between. There aren't too many things that interact with nightmare creatures in the same way that Bernie does, and if there are, almost all of those are tied to the late game, which is pretty insane once you actually think about it in that way. So the obvious conclusion that we could come to is that Klei balanced Willow around newer players as the primary demographic, since they are primarily the people that would benefit from bonus sanity management and options to deal with sanity creatures rather than just killing them yourself. Though I do think it's interesting that while Willow herself is kind of geared towards newer players, Willow's perks can still be used by experienced players even if they're not playing as Willow. If you're teamed up with a Willow, you have access to Bernie, which, if you're rushing Ruins, can be insanely helpful, since the biggest threat in Ruins is just getting overwhelmed by the sheer amount of enemies that you can find down there, with a solid chunk being nightmare creatures during the nightmare phase. So I think you can say that Klei was just thinking about the widespread player base as a whole when they were designing Willow, but at the same time, I do think it kind of leans towards the newer players. So I'd say we chalk it up to new players on that one, but it's definitely not something that is strictly limited to new players. Next up, let's talk about Wolfgang. Wolfgang was seen as a more meta character. He was used almost exclusively in speedruns, since he just had double damage, and killing bosses when you have double damage output is just really good. Pre-rework Wolfgang also had a speed boost, which would help exploring the map very early on, and would just let you go to things that much faster, which would help tremendously in speedruns. When they announced his rework, it was met with some pretty negative reception, all things considered. I will say I'm pretty guilty of that myself, since I wasn't too big of a fan of the changes, if we're being honest. In Wolfgang's rework, they outright removed his speed boost, and they tied his double damage output to being locked behind either a structure or standing still and lifting weights for an absurd amount of time. This kind of felt like a direct nerf to the speedrunning strats that people have already developed, and honestly, it didn't feel that great when it first came out. I think it's pretty safe to say that this was targeted towards a key demographic of players, that being the ones who could exploit Wolfgang for all that he was worth. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a good change in that regard, but I do think it was a change geared towards experienced players. I do think that this is kind of an unhealthy change in the beginning. They did do a lot of things to iron him out and make him a better character as time went on, since that negative reception towards his rework never really went away for the longest time, until very recently when they started changing him to be kind of absurdly good in comparison to what he used to be, in my opinion. But either way, this is Klei balancing around primarily experienced players, though there is something that can be said about newer players benefiting a little bit more from this. One of the big stereotypes of Wolfgang early on, pre-rework, was that Wolfgang would just go into your base and eat all of your food all of the time, because when he was mighty, he would drain hunger a little bit faster. And then his double damage wasn't ever really double damage, because his damage would scale proportionally to how much hunger he had. This would incentivize players to just always be at full hunger if you were not great at Wolfgang, I'll say it. Which created the stereotype of Wolfgang players just walking in, eating all your stuff constantly because they always have to have double damage. And that was a pretty big hindrance to basically everybody else in the server. Check out the Dean Withers video on it, by the way. It's really goofy, really funny. Shout out to him. But I think primarily, Klei has kind of gone on record on saying that Wolfgang was too strong pre-rework, which to me kind of indicates that they were bouncing around the people who could make the most out of him. Which I will say he was really strong, but I don't think he was like the best character. You know, I can and have gone on about like that design philosophy change, but I do think the bottom line is that they kind of did decide to balance it around experienced players and what they were doing, albeit in kind of a detrimental way to those experienced players. Now going on to WX, who I think is a great example of later updates. WX got essentially reworked from the ground up, no longer gaining an increase in his stats through eating gears or getting light and a speed boost when he gets struck by lightning. He now has different plugins that he can use to modify how he operates, and these cover tons of different things that will help him tremendously in his day-to-day. The only drawback being that WX needs to both scan the corresponding enemy to gain the circuit, and he needs to get the corresponding resources for that circuit. This drastically shifted how WX is played from a new and more experienced player's perspective. WX is now incentivized to rush the necessary scans and materials, which more often than not will lead you to going into the ruins to find what you're looking for. This plays into the ruins rushing playstyle that WX already kind of had going on for him, even pre-rework. Assuming that you want to get extra speed, which is, you know, the main draw when it comes to experienced players choosing him. As far as new players go, WX is definitely a better character, all things considered. The biggest issue that newer players had with WX was the required gears. New players would tend to just eat the gears all willy-nilly as WX, without any real concern of getting any of them for necessary structures like an icebox. This was a huge pain in public servers, and the changes definitely helped alleviate that, since now newer players aren't just going to walk in, smash your icebox, and eat the gears. Now, because of the new changes, WX is able to supplement his own health, sanity, and hunger by scanning some basic mobs, and just boosting those stats are things that will go a long way for helping new players stay alive just a little bit longer, and overall help with exploration and potentially mob interaction, both of which will help newer players learn the ins and outs of the game, which is a pretty solid thing for him overall. With these three characters in mind, we could kind of get a feel for where Klei lands, which, while it might be the milquetoast take, I think it's pretty clear that Klei balances their characters around a pretty widespread sample size of different players. And while yeah, some characters might have been changed with evidently one player base in mind, the characters themselves aren't really useless when it comes to being piloted by experienced players, or vice versa. Willow is still useful for experienced players since burning can be used as a sort of monkey bomb as far as nightmare creatures go, which is really useful in the ruins. and in key boss fights such as Fuel Weaver. And WX is useful for both newer and experienced players, since some of his upsides are more sought after by newer players than experienced players, and vice versa. And Wolfgang still retains his downsides and some of his upsides, leading players of all skill levels to being able to use his perks just a bit better. I will say though, it does kind of feel like newer players are people that they kind of have to cater to just inherently, which, you know, isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you want your game to grow, which, you know, I always want Don't Starve to grow, you do kind of have to make the barrier of entry a little bit easier. Since people who are just constantly dying over and over again, like in this game, and how you're kind of intended to, might get disincentivized from sticking to it. So every so often, Klei does feel like they have to throw them a bone, or at least that's how I see it. As far as experienced players go, I feel like experienced players kind of push the envelope for how good a character could be. And if that character is a bit better than Klei had initially intended, or better than the game developers would have liked, I do think that experienced players are the people that they kind of balance around in that regard, just to kind of reel them in. I will say though, Klei doesn't really do that all too often, which I really appreciate. I'm a big fan of the buffing instead of nerfing mentality when it comes to this game, and most other games for that matter. But I do understand why people might be a little bit upset about the game, quote unquote, getting easier. But, you know, I think there are a lot of things that you could talk about the game that should be a bit easier, or should just give you information outright. But, you know, that's probably for something else. Like, characters are pretty thoroughly designed to not just be useless to any one kind of player. And it definitely makes sense, since characters need to be really thorough in their design, just through the way the game is designed. Since character mechanics influence every facet of this game, since you kind of need to play a character in order to explore any of the other content, though that doesn't mean that other content can lack in how much it should be available to its players. So with that idea, let's go through content updates to hopefully understand Klei a little bit more. Let's take a look at Return of Them line of updates, since this is a really interesting update to look back at from a game design perspective, in my opinion at least. Return of Them was a series of updates that added tons of different mechanics, which mostly revolved around the ocean. As far as the ocean goes, it's gotten 2 major points of interest, 2 minor zones, and a couple of small mechanics that make the ocean feel, well, a bit more like an ocean. Let's start out with covering some of the minor zones and smaller mechanics, starting off with the ocean getting salt stacks and a bunch of fishing mechanics. I cover the fishing mechanics in another video, and as far as salt stacks go, they're not too impressive. They add salt and cookie cutters, both of which are used in a couple of recipes, you know, most notably Pearl's House and the Salt Box. This is a nice biome, and fishing could be a pretty good mechanic as far as getting food goes, but there's not really too much to say without getting really into the details as far as fishing goes. And I don't want this to turn into another fishing video, so let's just say that ocean fishing is a thing that exists in this game now, and let's leave it at that. If you're more interested, go check out the other video. But as far as the major points of interest go, there's really just the big 2, that being Lunar Island and Pearl's House. These are integral for getting through the game, with Lunar Island being used to set up to fight Celestial Champion, and Pearl's House being a required side quest to beating Crab King to get the Sanctum to fight Celestial Champion. I think these 2 are pretty interesting, since newer players don't really go out into the ocean. It feels like these are things that are kind of locked behind experienced players who know what they're doing and are feeling a bit adventurous, which I think is a pretty interesting choice to go through. I don't know if that's what more than just planting things and letting it grow for like a season. Now, if you're an experienced player who wants to know how things work, all of a sudden gardening becomes tremendously more complicated, but even more rewarding. Now there's all these nutrients that you want to balance out, and there's crops that provide and yield in different nutrients, plants that prefer each season, and things of that nature. This is really nice for experienced players because it provides a whole new mechanic for you to get into, while rewarding you with even more food and seeds as a result of engaging in those mechanics. I think Reap What You Sow did a lot for a huge variety of players, and it's a very well designed feature in my opinion. It's really hard to say who Klei was really gearing this around. I guess you can't say that it was geared towards newer players, since prior to this update, the mechanic was just bad. Like, oftentimes it was just seen as a noob trap, since it would take tons and tons of resources and give you very little reward for it. So just outright changing the mechanic and replacing it with something that is infinitely better can help newer players, but it definitely shines the most when an experienced player knows what they're doing and knows how to delve into the mechanic. So what's the conclusion overall? I think that, you know, once again, this is a pretty milquetoast statement, I feel, but Klei does try to keep all their players in mind. However, you can make the argument that because a lot of these updates have made the game easier, Klei caters towards newer players a bit more. But on the other, you can also say that most newer players wouldn't really get to experience some of the newer content that Klei is adding. So it makes it very difficult to say for certain who Klei really balances around if they consider one group in particular. And ultimately, updates are kind of high and low points in regards to who Klei caters for. There are some updates that are explicitly for one group, but not necessarily countered to those others. And I think that constant back and forth of adding new mechanics into the game that don't punish one side or the other inherently is a really interesting way to go about it. It's like they're trying to balance two things that are, you would think, at odds with one another, to make it so that both of them can just coexist simultaneously. It's a really interesting way to go about designing a game, and I think it's incredibly challenging to do so, but I think Klei's overall doing a pretty good job of it. I do think it's natural to want Klei to cater towards one group or another if you fall within that group, but I think that giving things to one group of players doesn't necessarily mean that it has to take away from another group of players. I think that's kind of a mistake that they did with the Wolfgang update, and since then, Klei's kind of reeled back, I would say. And even with the Wolfgang update, they did start listening to some more experienced players and start changing things here and there in order to make him a bit more rewarding to play for those players, which I think is a really good direction to go towards. You know, I will say, I do think we're a bit spoiled in this community, you know, I'll say it. I've seen a lot of different dev teams or communities or things of that nature where they introduce a change that is just so atrocious. It's like the worst thing that you've ever heard of. And you would think amongst all of the backlash, they would like reel back and say, okay, well, you know, obviously our community really doesn't like this thing, so we should probably like, you know, do something about it. We should like cancel it. We should scrap it, go back and change it. But, you know, sometimes they just ignore you. One of the biggest things that comes to mind, this is kind of like a side tangent from what the video was initially meant to be, but Discord was actually changing the way their usernames work, and everybody hated it. I think it's almost unanimously one of the biggest downgrades, because now people are like sniping usernames. It's a whole problem, you know? And I would think amongst all that backlash, they would go back and change it. But, you know, they doubled down. They were like, yeah, no, we don't care. And I think as somebody who's just been part of the Don't Starve community for as long as I have, like that really just caught me off guard, because that was like unheard of in my head. I was like, well, obviously they're going to go back and change it. No. But I digress. You know, that's like a whole side note, a whole tangent. Overall, I think Klei does their best to balance around whoever they feel the update is appropriate, and I think it's a really interesting way to go about it. That's all I really wanted to talk about, though. I am curious as to what you guys think, whether or not Klei balances more or less around other people, or whether or not you agree that they do try to balance around whoever they can. But that's all I really want to talk about. Let me know in the comments what you guys think, and until next time, bye-bye.